thank you for inviting me to come and talk to you. Now, look, whatever Joanna has said, I think you just need to hold that in abeyance, because what I'm going to say, I have no idea. And I've got a couple of lead-in places, but look, it's so heavy for me. You know, I'm 73 or something now, and to go back to when I was 27, back in 67, and then to go on into the 70s. I mean, I'm happy to talk to people. I'm much better one-on-one. It's so big. You know, it looms in my head like, where do I start? I've been reading this for the last 2 weeks, and I've been thinking about it, and I've been saying, well, yeah, what am I going to say to these people? You know, this build-up. I mean, unofficial founder of feminist art? Oh, my sisters, forgive me. Forgive Joanna. What has she claimed for this poor grey-headed old lady who lives in Canberra and has chooks and dogs and works in her studio in her backyard and walks the dogs and doesn't go anywhere much until someone like Joanna comes and gets a screwdriver and levers me out of my place to come down and try and talk to you about something that's relevant. And here I am. What I'd like to say, since part of my job is to launch Artlink, the relevance of Artlink to me, and I guess to many people, but to me, is that it's really broad-ranging and it covers many positions across the gender landscape. Now, that's really valuable to me at this time, you know, because I'm not up with everything that goes on when you've got to look after the chooks and the dogs and, you know, get to the studio once a day. You can't keep up with everything. And this is very valuable for me to hear voices that I don't have a chance to hear, younger people, people in very particular lifestyles and fighting very particular battles to do with gender and so on. And I read every one, and I'm not going to talk about them in particular, except really to point out this very valuable factor of their various refreshing particularities of current, importance. And of course, I was involved with, the liberation movements and gay liberation camp, as well as the women's movement and da-da-da-da-da. And, to catch up and see the spread and the change and to see the imaginings of young artists who are tackling it through different media from different points of view. All of that is fantastic and really important to me. Me now, my practice, on the other hand, all the particularities of the past, and it has been a pretty various life and a great deal of activity before I stopped being active. All of them, there are many different positions, different ideas, different ways I've explored the business of being an artist, being a woman artist, being a human, being a feminist. I call myself a feminist. I don't have a problem with it. All the different directions that I've taken, and if you do know my work, you do know that it is very diverse, and that diversity has been a great problem over the years for different critics, because it still goes against the traditions of one you know, a single artist, single medium, you know, main direction and topics, you know, subject matter, etc., etc. Well, I move, you know, and pretty much I always have. And I haven't actually been afraid to move, even though it seems, you know, there was a time when my galleries, after that very first show, public show that Joanna talked about, and it wasn't simply about female, the female organ. This one goes with another, which is a phallus, and the inspiration that came from it was to have a female organ and a male organ. My battles back then, our battles, were censorship. This is back in the 60s. Censorship and the question of, you know, what is art? What is art really in the face of, at that time, advertising and so on? So these days it's sort of, what is art that you might do on a flat surface, or, you know, still art, as against new media, etc. But back then it was, the real art was seen by some analysis to be, you know, the real topical art was seen to be what happened in advertising. So, and I find, you know, those basic questions, perhaps not so much the censorship one, although, you know, it's still, but the ongoing questioning of art and what it is and what it can be, what it is when it's acceptable to certain institutions, what it is when it's not, that remains constant. And I'm constantly moving in all sorts of ways, around and through and backwards and forwards and so on. But if I come back to a little bit about when I did this show back in '67, and much to my surprise, it brought the house down and Sydney was blown asunder and God only knows what happened. Yeah, that exhibition was. I'm getting away from the microphone. Does it need me to talk into the microphone? That exhibition was about a young woman, me, finding out what it was for her to be an artist, really, so that she knew, so that I knew that I'd touched that, and what it was to be an adult. I was exploring, you know, my sexuality. And yes, I did. There was another sort of thing that was kind of ambition, which was about, I felt, you know, that I wasn't recognised in the way that I understood myself. So that links in with a lot of the sort of goals and, you know, feelings and so on of, you know, people who are battling across the gender spectrum. But much to my, I mean, yes, I knew I was going against prevailing sort of, you know, conventions. What I was actually doing was, I had actually found that a lot of those conventions that I'd learnt about in art school didn't hold up in practice. You know, I was teaching and I'd go to sort of tell a student that, oh, they mustn't do compositions that, you know, had concentrated in a certain way on the centre or had people standing along the bottom, you know, people standing along the bottom of that was illustration. But the problem was that I found that when I went to say, no, you shouldn't do this, and I'd look at it and I'd say, there's nothing wrong with that, I'd be looking at it and I'd be saying. And so when in this sort of investigation of what it was to be an artist, I actually started going back and cutting through and breaking down and going in the opposite direction of all those conventions that I'd, you know, learnt about in art school. And I hit it. I got it. I got what it was for me to be an artist. There was no denying it. I got it. That's what it was about for me And I found that after this period of working in intense, self-centred, cut off, working with the private and the personal, instead of that turning out to be something that no one else related to, people all over the place were relating to it. Unexpected people I didn't even, So that killed that business about, not cutting yourself off too much and not, going into that sort of personal area. So, but I mean, it's true that after that I did move out into society in a different way, and I won't follow the whole adventure and what each section was actually searching out for me. I'll just jump across to the time in the 70s, early 70s. Fag dens had been forgotten, 67, that had all been forgotten and so on. And then the liberation movements were happening and women's liberation and so on. I didn't become sort of politicised through those movements so much as when the women's art movement started, and that started for us in Sydney when Barbara Hall and her then partner Peter, give it to me, I can't remember names, sorry Pete, went to America, and Peter was making a film on alternate practices, and they met up with Lucy Lippard, a number of other people, and Barbara learnt about the slide register that had been set up at LA or San Francisco and other places, and she came back with this as an idea, and so we did set up one in Sydney. Now we didn't ever get a big grant, so we weren't able to continue it up West Melbourne. They got a big Schools Commission grant, was it? Yeah, Schools Commission grant, and that enabled them to really do it in a serious way, and it still survives today, as you probably know. We started with, when Barbara came back, she started getting in touch with some of the known women artists, Joan Grounds, myself, Jude Adams, because Joan Grounds had a profile at that time, and a few other people, and it got us together, and we started just talking together in groups and talking about our work and so on and so forth. And that was the beginning of the women's art movement. And, Benita came up with work that she was exhibiting. I can't put all this together in chronological order. You need to read your history books. And we eventually had a little rundown building in Newtown. But in those, there was a lot of these kind of movements, the Art Workers Union and, things like this that, those of us that were active at that time were involved with. But they tended to have a lifespan of, 2 or 3 years actually, working without funds. If you haven't got funds, you use blood, sweat and tears, and flesh, and so that without funds you don't go far. If you look at all those organisations like church groups and so on, they got property, and that was good basis for them. Now we weren't canny enough, or to be able to do that, but it nonetheless was a start of something that rolled on. And we spent a lot of time making contact with women around the country, and we'd travel. And of course in the 70s there was this extraordinary period when this share so much focus all the time on, you know, one thing, one issue, one idea. It could be, and the ideas could be anything from the banal to the magnificent, the sublime, the political, the whatever. I'm not an activist in the same way anymore, but I look at my work and I see it all there. It's political in that way that we as feminists did recognise. You know, it's not really consciously subversive, and yet it is subversive when you analyse the processes and so on that, you know, go along with it. Works evolve for me from what I call, what I think of as being little brain bubbles. You know, these things kind of, you know, they sort of force their way through, you know, this little brain bubbles, and then they go, and, you know, while there's a sort of intuitive attachment to that, you know, that follows, and I don't know where it's going necessarily at all. And sometimes, you know, I frequently feel I'm on the edge of falling into some kind of abyss that's to do with not just the abject or the rejected, you know, or just in the way, you know, in behaviour, in way we seem to be meant to be human and so on. And I feel as if, you know, I just got to hold my nerve and stay in there in the face of stuff that I know would be considered as not the way to go. And it's not moral, but it's about being and living and searching, and that process actually can take you through to something that does open out into an insight that's not just gone through conventional ways, but gone through the back alleys and, you know, the bypasses and rejected areas as well, and can bring together, some sense of what it is to be human in a really quite, in a very satisfying way, a way that, and I never know quite where I'm going, and by the time the work gives me messages that, okay, this is it, and or okay, you can go out now, and it's like, of course I own it, but I also don't own it. And we hear artists saying this frequently, that, you know, the work happens and it doesn't come out of all their conscious, and it's been put as, you know, they're channels. I don't call myself a channel, but I do understand that the mind is complex and that there are parts of the mind that we use in different kinds of activities and actions, and this business of making and creating is about allowing, not trying to force or expecting outcomes, but allowing. And that allowing, I'm saying this at 72, certainly this early work was my first experience of images that I didn't expect, that came out of the subconscious or something, you know. So that was my first experience of that then. But at this stage, this business of allowing the works to be and then letting them be, even if you sort of really stand back and you think, oh God, you know, what's happened this time? Anyway, so that's my and I think that why I've taken the time to talk about my practice is because I think that this kind of practice is the kind of practice that feminism had a lot to do with opening up. And I see the diversity, the moving around, so much of my practice as a result of those questions that we asked about, if we live within this thing called patriarchy, and so everything is affected by that, then what else is there? And, as feminists, we realised early that it wasn't simply a matter of flipping the coin, or many of us did. I mean, there's still people who feel that, but that's what you do. You need to turn it over and get rid of the patriarchy altogether. But many of us knew that it was about being human, and it's about societies and so on. And that's my strong belief that at this stage, that the way I've been able to practice, and of course I knew enough about the establishment and I never wanted to lose touch with it. I did a lot of community work. It was never my goal to just disappear into community. My goal was to get in touch with people's creativity. But it was always important for me to have, this contact. And that's been a bit of a difficult struggle. So in some ways, some people some curators and so on have dismissed me as a result of some of that. But nonetheless, that's what I think. Haven't I gone long enough? Yeah. Thank you so much for listening.
Normally when we start these things, we start with an acknowledgement to country, and so I don't want to do it to sort of shame anyone, but just more to ground ourselves a little bit. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we're standing on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge ancestors past and elders present and future, because I've been thinking about, Vivienne while she's been talking. I've been thinking about the elders that we have in the room, and thinking about, the whole reason that, I've had an education that I've had is because the women before me fought for it. And it's not so long ago. I'm the first person in my family to go to university. And, I went to university in 1993. And so when we talk about, when people talk about feminism no longer being relevant to them, I just think, well, you just got to step back a few years, and all this stuff that you take for granted actually didn't exist. And so one of the things that Joanna and I were really interested in doing was kind of looking at a sort of a bit of a broader frame of reference, and to take in our own pasts and our own present, and to think about a sort of a broader context for sex and gender. And one of the things that that started the whole conversation between us, and basically it was Stephanie Britton going, "You must co-edit this edition of Artlink with Joanna Mendelssohn." I was like, okay, yes, okay, because I'd never met Joanna and Joanna had never met me, and we just decided to do it together. And I think I was on a bit of a high at that point, actually, and I think that a lot of my activity around that time had been totally about creating this amazing festival of sex and gender, and looking at all of the different permutations of this in an Australian context, and working with fantastic artists and writers and performers and, just wonderful people, and made this fantastic bubble. And at this moment, I feel like the bubble has been stabbed to death. But it hasn't really. But it's just that feeling, have a big sigh over it. So I think I've been a bit sort of like, do we have to talk about sex and gender now that there's only one cabinet minister that's a woman? I think that Vivienne has a longer term view of these things because she's an older woman, and we were just talking about this before, about like the kinds of the steps that you make forward into a more progressive culture, and then the steps that that are taken back. And at this time of making sexes, I thought that we were dancing in the fucking ashes of the patriarchy, which we wanted to be doing. And I'm sure it's going to happen again. And so I might talk a bit about this, and also one of my bestest friends. So, I mean, you know, hello, no editorial bias going on in here with a massive article on her work. She's a big friend of mine, and she came up to me and said, I had a dream about the most amazing exhibition that ever was. And as usual, when people start telling me about their dreams, I took the position of the psychologist and just went, well, yes, that's very interesting. You know, carry on, etc. Not really listening to the dream, because dreams of other people really bore me. It's the same as people talking about their cats, because my cat is the most fucking amazing cat that has ever lived, and everybody else's cat sucks. So Deborah started talking to me about her dream, which was she was at an exhibition. Everybody was wearing novelty moustaches. Everybody was dressed outlandishly. All of the best artists in the world were there, except for she wasn't one of the artists, and she wondered why she wasn't one of the artists. And she discovered during the dream that she was actually one of the curators. You know, because she's not one of those curators that programs herself into her own shows, like a lot of them tend to do. And so Deborah came to Jeff Kahn and I at Performance Space and talked about this dream, and Jeff was far more receptive to the dream than I was originally. And we started to work towards a project. Actually, we started to work towards this project for the Adelaide Biennale, and we didn't get the gig, and so we decided to do it anyway. And we decided to make it a festival. We decided to make it a festival that would include an exhibition, a whole series of performances from contemporary dance to performance art, and then quite a massive public program. And we had noted that there had been a lot of exhibitions about feminism. You know, there was another wave of feminism coming up that we were really aware of, and then been a lot of exhibitions about masculinities, but there hadn't really been anything that tried to sort of tackle sex and gender and to bring the whole kind of crazy gamut of things together in one place. And so we decided to do that. And this is what Joanna saw, and when they asked me to co-edit the edition at Artlink. And so, if you're okay, I'll just go through some of the slides and talk about what's in the pictures. And I'm really happy to answer questions afterwards about our broader intention. But for now, yes, pictures. Okay, so this is the work by Parachutes for Ladies and Jessica Oliveri. Jessica made a work, actually there's a longer story to this, but we'd actually had a little bit of a slightly tiny falling out, because she was curating a program that we did called Nighttime, and I had decided that Nighttime was going to happen in a church for a program of off-site works that we were doing. It was in the Anglican church at Newtown, and Jess pulled out because she just wasn't happy with the stance of the church in general on gay marriage, on same-sex marriage. And so she made this work with Parachutes for Ladies, which are a collective of women that sort of interchange into different roles. And in this case, the Parachutes for Ladies are opera singers and other kinds of singers. And she worked with a composer to devise a number of songs that were sung over the top of one another about acceptance in the church of gay marriage. And this was performed on the opening night. Philip Brophy. Philip Brophy is one of my favourite artists in Australia. This is a live performance that he did at the opening of Sexes called Stadium. And he drags himself onto stage as a sort of cadaverous kind of rock god and starts to play the drums, and he's an amazing drummer. But the kind of the work that he made for the exhibition was like a 3-screen kind of surround sound work, which kind of looked at all of the kind of imagery of cock rock of the 80s. And crashing waves and dancing girls and all those kinds of things. This is a poo. This is a ceramic poo by Trevor Fry. Trevor Fry I met when he was part of a group called the Wild Boys, who did sort of amazing, tragic, tranny, abjection kind of performance works in the earlier part of the 2000s. And then I found out that he had started making ceramics, which I thought was incredible. And so he's made all of these sort of totemic kind of phallic objects. And I think this is kind of one of the biggest installations of those objects that he's ever done. And so I was really happy to be the facilitator of that. And so he kind of created this kind of ruin, this sort of contemporary ruin for his phallic idols. This is in the public space of the Carriage Works. If you haven't been already, you probably will, because the Contemporary Art Fair has taken over and is opening on Thursday night. This is work by Eric Bridgman. This is the shrouded version of the work that he did for the exhibition. That's an unshrouded work, but there we go. This is a project that he did fusing the heads of AFL footballers onto porn star bodies. He was looking at the kind of hypersexualisation, but also the kind of the sort of backlash of that sexualisation of sports stars in Australia. This is installation by the Kingpins, which kind of takes the example. I don't know if you guys know about the World in Dubai. It's like a world that is a series of man-made islands in the shape of the globe. And later on in the video, the Kingpins make this island out of jizz. There was a lot of dick in this show, and in fact, I had to make quite a few walls in the foyer for this exhibition, which I called cock blockers, because it was kind of like this visual kind of like play of like stopping the children from seeing penis, which was mostly happening in the public spaces. Marley Dawson did a beautiful work, and you can't really sort of get the scale of it here, but through the Carriage Works there's this amazing gantry that has a series of machines that still are operable that run through it. And so he got the sort of these little turbines to start working again, and these massive sort of wheels above your heads. And then he got this, it's called a drive shaft. That's why it was kind of a sexist thing. It's kind of about the sexualisation of this kind of industrial space. And then he got this massive kind of wheels to actually turn this very small lathe with a very tiny coin on it. This is inside Bay 19, which is one of the spaces that we use in Carriage Works for exhibitions. It's kind of a black box space. It's not very good for two-dimensional work, but sometimes we do it anyway in this case. This is work by Chidam Idemir. You can see Chidam hovering just up ahead. She made a burqa for one of the passageways of the Carriage Works, so it actually covered about 20 metres worth of walkway and totally enclosed it, and for several performances she installed herself in the burqa with just the little eye slit that you could see her face through. And Chidam's in the Artlink. This is work by Liam Benson on the right. Liam's probably pretty well known to you. He makes work with really sort of Australian, it's like twisting Australian iconographies of masculinity and femininity. I love the image on the left of the kind of the wife beater tan with these diamantes covering his torso. This is work by Sangeeta Chandrasekhar and Luke. Oh gosh, sorry. I've had a couple of wines and proper nouns just really go out the window for me. So this is an exquisite corpse work between two artists who sent each other through the mail images of the body that would change. Luke Parker, dear oh dear. Luke is also a curator, and he's also curated a project on masculinities about 10 years ago. This is a work by Julie Rapp, in fact 2 works which we brought together through time. So the work on the wall is called Hair Rail, and that work she actually showed in 1992. It's a collection of hair that's inside this acrylic rail. It's very beautiful, and it looks like it was made yesterday, and it still has that same sort of like tactility and this idea of this abject thing inside. And she showed it alongside Stepping Out, which is a new series of bronze feet which were made after a series of images that she made in early 2000s, I think 2002, of a sort of a female foot that has morphed into a heel. This is work by Natalia Hughes. It's one of 2 works in the exhibition that sort of draws reference on Judy Chicago's The Dinner Party. And Natalia made this work for the women's show at Goma, and we asked her if we could sort of take part, because it was like this quite elaborate room that she created with a dinner table and with really overstuffed chairs. It was something that we kind of wanted to bring something of inside of the exhibition, and she's made this wallpaper. You can't see it, the detail in it, but it's of 2 beavers, angry beavers, and a taco, which is in the middle frame, and sort of ideas about sort of feminine parts and sort of wordplay around that. This is work by Christian Thompson, who is a Indigenous artist, a photomedia artist, and one of the first Indigenous scholars at Oxford University. He has a Charles Perkins Scholarship at Oxford University at the moment, and he's been living in Europe for quite a few years, to and from, and he made this work about 5 years ago when he was living in Amsterdam, and he kind of does sort of like a reversal of the kinds of images that I guess we're used to seeing in sort of Heidelberg, down on his luck kind of era painting, and places himself as an Indigenous man in this sort of European forest context. These few works are by John Mead. He's a sculptor from Melbourne, and he starts with form that turns into these kind of gendered things. The one on the left is called Gary Ablett Jr. I love that work, it's so funny. It's got 2 little balls that hang down from its middle. That work's called Share, like as in the singer. And this is a still from work by Pilar Mata-Dupont and Taryn Gill, who are artists from Western Australia that make work kind of based on the sort of perfection of gender seen in films by Leni Riefenstahl and propaganda films of that era of Nazism and fascism in Europe. And Pilar is embarking on a bigger project that actually engages with her own family's connections to fascism, which I'm really sort of interested in seeing how that comes through. This is work by Paul Knight. It's a diaristic work of many, many images that sort of range from very sort of banal images of serving dinner in the lounge room to sex images to holiday images, and accompanied by a soundtrack. This is the second work that was based on the dinner party. This is by a group called Level from Brisbane that made an audio work about feminism and invited different women to come around to various dinner parties and talk about what feminism meant to them, and you could hear those conversations through the headphones. And then we moved to performance. This is work by Julianne Long, who's a very senior performance and dance artist in Sydney. This is a project called Something in the Way She Moves, which was about the invisibility of middle-aged women. This is a panel that we put together around gender play called Insight, and it was based on Jenny Brockie's Insight, only with Pauline Pantsdown playing Jenny Brockie, and Insight spelled I-N-C-I-T-E. And all of the participants are performers that play with gender identity, and that turned into a party. This is a project called Whelping Box by Matt Prest and Lee Wilson, and it's a work exploring the transferal of violent masculine behaviours. We had a beautiful night where we invited Elvis Richardson, who's also in this edition of Artlink, to talk about her ongoing project Countess, which looks statistically like at the truth of the representation of women in the art world. And that was a really wonderful talk, and she gave that alongside Anne Summers, who's quite a senior journalist, and did an amazing speech called Her Rights at Work, which looked at the treatment of Julia Gillard during her term in office and how it actually wouldn't be acceptable in any single workplace except for, the highest office in Australia. We also got to do some beautiful work with performance artists at that time for one night extravaganza. The ability to pair sort of drag queens with contemporary dancers for single evenings was really wonderful. And finally, we did a project with Eddie Sharp and his erotic fan fiction readings, and Andrew Frost gave a talk and wrote a fiction about Miranda Devine, and he can talk about that or not. Thank you.
I was approached by Sandra McMahon, who is the director of the Tamworth Regional Gallery, last year with the proposition that I might be interested in curating a show that they were putting together. And I'm always up for a gig, for travelling to do something new. And I was very interested to find out what this show was. So in a nutshell, it was essentially three women painters based in Tamworth had got together and wanted to do a show. And it was an interesting proposition because the show had an idea behind it, a theme, which was to ask the question whether female painters brought something to the subject of landscape painting that was measurably different to those of male painters. And of course, when you think of contemporary feminist art practice and exhibitions like this, of course you immediately think of me, the white male middle-aged guy who talks about art on television. So I was intrigued about the idea. It connected to areas of art that I was interested in. In my PhD research, I looked quite extensively at historic landscape painting and its relationship to cinema, and therefore connecting then to science fiction. But how this might play out and how it would work, I wasn't sure. So I began to do some research and some reading, and soon found that the idea that perhaps there was a feminist discourse on nature and on landscape painting in particular was very much a work in progress. I've actually found a text by an American feminist author named Stacia Aylmo, who I had discovered through my readings on science fiction cinema, who had put together a couple of books, one collection of essays by numerous authors and one book of her own, which looked into this very question. And so reading it eagerly, I soon discovered that there was no easy or short answer to that question. That the idea that nature as a subject, although gendered in very fundamental respect, was not necessarily one that had been theorised as a subject in feminist art as such. And although feminist art had historically been connected to subjects of the body and domesticity and social roles and so forth, to separate out a kind of feminism that connected to questions of nature, of the representation of nature, the representation of the land in painting, and by that I mean the Western tradition, was still, as I say, a work in progress. And so I thought the best way to proceed was to proceed with an open mind and to see what came out of it. So I thought I might just talk you through some of the things that I discovered in the process of putting the show together, and then end up with some pictures from the exhibition. So the three artists who had put this idea together were Michelle Hungerford, Charmaine Pike, and Gabrielle Collins, and they painted within a very discrete tradition of gestural abstraction and representational painting. And so in terms of what this show would be, there was a number of logical or illogical choices one could make about extending that out. And so I decided to look at the stylistic continuity of the works in the show, and to look at other female painters who may connect stylistically and add something interesting to the show. And so I first thought of Joanna Logue, who is an artist who shows here in Sydney at King Street Gallery, who has been living on and off in Oberon and west of, just on the other side of the mountains for some 20 years, who's recently relocated to Melbourne. But I knew her work and liked it very much, and so I thought it would logically connect. My friend Carrie Miller suggested that I look at the work of a painter who was then based in Melbourne named Amber Wallace. And one of the first things that really caught my eye was that Amber had a show called I Fuck Mountains, which is an incredibly spectacularly provocative title for a show on landscape. And so with those two in mind, I thought, well, let's go out and meet them and go and visit them in their studios and see what they were doing. So my daughter Lily and I set out in the Gulf and drove to Oberon to visit Joanna in her beautiful studio, and had a look at what she'd been doing. I very deliberately took Lily on this excursion because she's been to a few openings and she's kind of curious about the art world, but I wanted her to have the opportunity to see a female artist working in her studio, to see someone being creative in a way that she could relate to, but also, having some daddy Lily time together for 48 hours was a good trip. And so we went to visit Joanna, who is seen here with her Italian greyhound named Cinnamon. Joanna works directly from studies that she conducts in the landscape, in the old style, the en plein air of drawing, but also she takes photographs of areas that interest her. She had for a long time only painted the views from the windows of her studios and her garden around her beautiful, and I say beautiful in full acknowledgement of the meaning of that word, 19th century house surrounded by ornate gardens. But she had also travelled back and forth between Oberon and Melbourne and had gone to Gundagai as a waypoint and became fascinated by the remnant bridges there from the 19th century. Started doing paintings on paper and drawings. Now, she's very influenced by Gerhard Richter's techniques, but perhaps unlike Richter, she has stuck pretty assiduously to one style. I think probably one of the most fascinating aspects of her practice is how much of it is based in photography. She works very often from photographs and works to deliberately translate the photographs onto canvas. And so when you see these paintings in the gallery setting, or also in her studio, they have a very abstract quality to begin with, but as you sort of take a few steps back, they begin to coalesce before your eyes into landscapes. She was also experimenting with painting from memory, trying to recreate for herself the sort of sensuous relationship we have with our favourite places, because in Melbourne she's living quite close to the Docklands now and the centre of Melbourne, and she told me that she'd been feeling spiritually disconnected from her home and wanted to somehow revisit that. And so some of the work she created were purely based on memory rather than on source material. Here are some photographs that she had taken of the bridges from which she worked, and they were very much the source material for this series. She works with video as well as photography, but made the decision for this show that she would work only in painting. That's actually a detail of a work that wasn't actually included in the final show, but sort of demonstrates part of her process. Joanna is very fortunate to have this amazing studio space, which is one of those industrial prefabricated sheds that people have on properties in Australia, where they lay down some concrete and put one of these things on top, and she has all of this space to move and to experiment and to have groups of works laid out, which she returns to and works in series. So a couple of months later, at the end of the month, I went up to Tamworth to visit the other three artists and found quite an interesting difference in their working situations. I first visited Michelle Hungerford, who has her own prefabricated studio space on her property, which is on a hill on the outskirts of Tamworth. This is her studio, and she likes to work at scale, and really for Michelle, a small scale seems quite restrictive, and so she not only produced large work, she produced lots of large works. This is one that didn't actually make it into the exhibition. She is a true en plein air painter. A lot of the work she does is based entirely on sketches and material that she's produced in the land, travelling out to record things, either going on her own or with groups of other artists. It's a bit of a detail of that one. And by complete contrast, this is the entry to the studio of Charmaine Pike, who at this time, although I think she's about to move, has been living with her parents, or perhaps just her mother, in the unfashionable end of Tamworth, far from the Golden Guitar. And she has the classic studio in the garage. And this is an example of her working space. She has a lot of material stuck up around the walls, and she works on masonite, painting directly onto board and so forth. One of the things that really intrigued me about her work when I first saw it was that it seemed to have a very immediate connection to Philip Guston in the way she put her stuff together. But when I mentioned it, she kind of said, "Please don't say that name, I hear it all the time." So I've tried to avoid mentioning it again, but look, I've done it again, sorry. But it has a similar sense of architecture and a similar sense of outline and detail. She told me she was a horsey girl. She grew up on a farm. She had a lot of experiences of riding horses. This horse she's holding here on the top is a weird battery-operated horse that had kind of artificial flesh. And it was really interesting thing to touch. And this is Gabrielle Collins' studio. This is another purpose-built studio. She's quite lucky, I'm sure she would acknowledge, to have this beautiful space to work in, but unlike the others, she works at very small scale. You can see on the wall behind her there's some of her paintings of actually of Sydney Harbour, and she's working at kind of postcard size. The gallery space at Tamworth is generous, to say the least. It's an enormous space, and with Michelle and the others and Joanna threatening to paint big, Gabrielle was under pressure to bring out the big guns, and you can see in the background there some of her larger paintings, which are about 80 by 80. But I think, classic artist studio, working through sketches first, en plein air stuff that she was doing at small scale, bringing this material back to the studio. I mean, it's classic painter's stuff. So last week was the opening of the exhibition, and I went up on Wednesday last week to hang the show. My wife and daughter came up on Friday for the opening. So this is just a few shots of the show taken with my iPhone. So what was the outcome of all of this? One of the interesting things about talking to the painters, to the artists, was that they did not ascribe to the idea that they were feminists in a political sense. Yet it seemed to me that everything that they were able to do was, much as Vivienne described before, the outcome of a set of circumstances. And so the curatorial question wasn't so much a question of trying to deduce or determine some measurable optical difference between the work of male painters and female painters, but rather to ask what the context was of these artists asking the question and being artists in the classic sense, to be painters who had studios, who had exhibitions, who sold their work, who had careers. Joanna is probably currently the most commercially successful of the group, having had a long exhibiting career with commercial galleries. Amber is an art star on the rise. She's a younger artist. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to visit her for a couple of different reasons. She's now living in Byron, and she's been unwell recently, so I hadn't been able to go to her studio. But the other three, Charmaine exhibits at Defiance Gallery here in Sydney, and Michelle and Gabrielle both, until very recently, taught at TAFE in Tamworth until the state government ripped the guts out of that program. They're now doing teaching painting through the regional gallery. So in terms of what constitutes a career, the 5 women were, I think, representative of a range of possible career positions, but also, and I think in a real and meaningful and fundamental way, were in a position to be artists, to be the artists that they wanted to be, and to also engage with a genre of art making which, as we know, has been traditionally dominated by male artists, even now. And so the question of the exhibition, was there a feminine view to the work, was yes, there was, but it was as much found in the role of being an artist as it was in the work that they were making. So this is some of the pieces that Amber produced for the show. Her work is quite interesting. It kind of my big conceptual idea for including her in the show was that, unlike the other artists, she was interested in the idea of landscape as a genre, and a lot of the work that she had done previously was entirely, the invention of her mind. She was producing stuff in her studio, and the I Fuck Mountains title related to the kind of power relationship, if you like, between the subject and the artist, and she was taking on the assertive role of the one who was creating these spaces. But then she just completely blew that out of the water for me by saying, "Hey, I'm living in Byron now. I'm going to paint some trees outside." So I was like, "Well, okay." But this one painting here is like an example of that imaginative space. These earlier ones are kind of free-form interpretations of actual space. These are some pieces of Charmaine Pike's in the exhibition. You can still see the who influence in the work, but still very strong in its own terms. And I think a logical visual progression from Amber's painting. I would skip around to the other end of the exhibition, and this is an install shot of on the right there. That's Joanna Logue's painting, and on the left you can just see on the other wall one of Michelle Hungerford's paintings. This again, I hopefully kind of represented a logical stylistic continuity in the exhibition. This is the one bridge painting that made it into the exhibition. On the right there, on the left there is one of her memory landscapes. A number of small works there, the trio of small works. This is another of Michelle's, although in colour this time. The black and white landscapes. And this rather gorgeous sequence of paintings. There's actually about 10 in the series by Gabrielle Collins. And her big works, her paintings of the landscape in Tasmania. Thanks.